Every evening, just as the Oregon sky dims into amber, one mustang breaks away from the herd and returns to the same patch of ground, standing still, as if listening. No fence holds him there, no handler calls him back, yet something beneath that soil keeps drawing him in. And no one knows why, pressing into dry soil with a rhythm that didn't match the drifting herd behind him. Mara straightened, pushing off the fence without realizing she had been holding her breath. He didn't look back. At the far edge of the pasture where an old windbreak stood half-collapsed, Calder stopped. Not near it, not beside it, but a few feet out where the ground flattened into a patch of bare earth, stripped of grass as if something had once rested there too long. He lowered his head, and then nothing. No pawing, no digging, no restless circling, just stillness. Mara frowned slightly, her eyes narrowing the way they always did when something didn't fit. Horses moved for reasons: hunger, fear, curiosity, pressure. Even their silence usually had direction. But this was something else. It wasn't absence. It felt like waiting. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of dry soil and old wood. Calder didn't move. Minutes passed. The rest of the herd drifted further away, their shapes softening into the fading light. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked as Tessa closed up for the evening. But Calder remained, anchored to that single patch of ground, as if the rest of the world had stepped back and left him there alone. "All right," Mara murmured under her breath, more to herself than to him. The next evening he did it again, and the evening after that. By the fourth day she stopped telling herself it was coincidence. She tested small things first, moved the water trough closer to the center of the pasture, adjusted feeding time by half an hour, watched from different angles, from different distances. Calder adapted to everything, except that. Always the same hour, always the same direction, always the same place. It wasn't urgency. He never rushed. It wasn't fear. He never startled. It wasn't habit in the usual sense either, because habits drift when the world shifts around them. This didn't drift. It held. On the sixth evening, Mara walked out before he did. The ground felt ordinary beneath her boots, dry, compacted, nothing that would catch a careless eye. She crouched, brushing her fingers lightly across the surface. No fresh disturbance, no roots exposed, no scent she could place, just earth. Behind her, she heard the soft, measured sound of hooves. She didn't turn immediately. When she did, Calder was already there, a few yards away, watching her. Not tense, not defensive, just present. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, not toward her, but toward the spot. Mara shifted back, giving him space without thinking about it. Calder reached the place she had just touched and lowered his head again, standing where he always stood, as if her presence had made no difference at all. That was when she felt it. Not fear, not confusion, but something quieter. A question that didn't belong to her alone anymore. She stayed until the last light drained from the sky, until Calder finally lifted his head and walked back to the herd as if nothing had happened. But as she turned toward the barn, the image of that bare patch stayed with her, sharper than anything else in the fading day, not because of what she saw, but because of what she couldn't. And for the first time, Mara understood something she hadn't allowed herself to think before. If a horse keeps returning to the same place, it isn't always the horse that needs to be understood. Sometimes, it's the place. The next morning, Mara didn't mention it to anyone. She moved through her routine the way she always had, checking hooves, refilling troughs, watching for the small signs most people missed. But her attention kept drifting back to the far edge of the pasture, to that narrow strip of ground that had no reason to matter, and yet did. Calder grazed with the others as if nothing had changed. If someone had arrived that day and looked across the field, they would have seen a normal herd. A few younger mustangs testing space between each other. One older gelding keeping to himself. Nothing unusual, nothing worth stopping for. But Mara had already learned that the absence of noise didn't mean the absence of meaning. By late afternoon she made a decision. Joel Brenner arrived just before sunset, his truck rolling slowly up the dirt road, tires crunching against gravel with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. He stepped out without hurry, closing the door behind him with a quiet thud, his eyes already scanning the pasture before Mara said a word. "You said he returns to the same spot," Joel said, not as a question. Mara nodded once. "Every day, same time, same place." Joel didn't ask anything else. He just leaned against the fence beside her, both of them watching as the light began its slow descent toward evening. For a while nothing happened. The herd shifted lazily, drifting through patches of grass. A breeze moved across the land, flattening the taller stems before letting them rise again. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk called out once, then disappeared into the sky. Then Calder lifted his head. Joel saw it immediately. Not the movement itself, but the stillness that followed it. "Watch his line," Mara said quietly. Calder stepped away from the herd, not cutting through it, not weaving between bodies. He chose a path that avoided contact altogether, his hooves tracing the same invisible route he had walked the nights before. Joel's gaze followed closely, narrowing just slightly, as Calder crossed the open stretch of pasture. "No deviation," Joel murmured. "Not even a step." Mara didn't answer. They both knew what that meant. Calder reached the edge of the windbreak and slowed, the way he always did, not stopping abruptly, but easing into stillness as if approaching something that required care. He stepped onto the bare patch and lowered his head. Joel exhaled softly. "That's not random." "No," Mara said. "It isn't." They stood there longer this time, watching not just Calder, but the space around him. The way he positioned his body. The way his ears shifted, not toward sound, but toward something internal, something remembered. "Any pawing?" Joel asked. "Never." "Digging?" "No." Joel nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Then he's not trying to get to something." Mara glanced at him. "What do you think he's doing?" Joel didn't answer right away. Instead, he pushed off the fence and walked out into the pasture, his steps measured, deliberate. Not toward Calder directly, but toward the line Calder had taken, placing his own boots where the hooves had fallen. Mara followed at a distance. By the time Joel reached the bare patch, Calder had already stepped back, giving him space without resistance. There was no tension in him, no sign of ownership or defense. Just that same quiet presence. Joel crouched low, one hand resting against his knee as he studied the ground. From a distance, it looked like nothing. Up close, it still looked like nothing. But Joel didn't rush. He brushed his fingers lightly across the surface, feeling for inconsistencies the eye might miss. The soil was compact, but not hardened, undisturbed, but not untouched by time. "Old compression," he said under his breath. Mara stepped closer. "From what?" Joel tilted his head slightly, scanning the surrounding area, the windbreak, the slope, the way the land dipped almost imperceptibly. "Could have been something stored here years back," he said. "Temporary, not meant to stay." Mara folded her arms, her gaze moving between Calder and the ground. "Then why would he remember it?" Joel looked up at her. "Horses don't remember objects the way we do," he said. "They remember places, the way a place feels, the way it smells after something's been there long enough." Mara let that settle. Behind them, the herd had moved further out, their shapes fading into the softening light. Calder stood a few yards away now, no longer on the patch, but not far from it either. Watching, but not interfering, as if the act of returning had already been fulfilled. Joel stood, brushing the dust from his hands. "We should mark it." Mara nodded. They placed a small flag at the edge of the patch, not in the center, not where Calder stood, but just enough to hold the boundary in place. A human attempt to fix something that had existed long before they noticed it. The sky dimmed further, shadows stretching across the pasture. "Tomorrow," Joel said, turning back toward the fence. "We dig." Mara looked once more at the ground, then at Calder. He had already begun to walk away, rejoining the herd without hesitation, without pause. But now the place he left behind no longer felt empty. It felt unfinished. And as the wind moved across the land again, lifting the scent of dry earth into the cooling air, Mara realized something had shifted, not in Calder but in them. They were no longer watching, they were involved. Morning came without ceremony. No urgency, no sense of discovery waiting beneath the surface, just a pale sky and the steady rhythm of work beginning again. Mara moved through the barn in silence, pulling on her gloves, checking the tools she rarely used for anything beyond fence posts and shallow repairs. A spade, a narrow digging bar, nothing excessive, nothing that assumed more than what they knew. Joel arrived early. He didn't speak much when he stepped out of the truck, only nodded once toward the pasture. The air was cooler than the night before, carrying that dry, mineral scent that lingered in open land after long seasons without rain. Calder was already out with the herd, but he wasn't grazing. He stood off to one side, not near the patch, not drawing attention, just positioned where he could see it. Mara noticed. She didn't comment. They walked out together, tools in hand, boots pressing into soil that felt firmer in the morning light. The small flag they had placed the evening before fluttered faintly, marking the edge of something they still couldn't define. Joel stopped a step short of it. "Not too deep at first," he said. "If something's there, it won't be far." Mara nodded, then drove the spade into the earth. The first layer gave easily. Dry, loose enough to turn without resistance. She worked in a slow, deliberate rhythm, cut, lift, shift, keeping the edges clean, careful not to disturb more than necessary. Joel crouched nearby, brushing away loose soil with his hands, watching for any change in texture, any interruption in the uniform ground. For a while there was nothing, just dirt, the kind of dirt that fills silence and stretches time. Mara paused after a few minutes, leaning slightly on the handle of the spade. "Could be nothing," she said, not as doubt, but as acknowledgment. Joel shook his head lightly. "Even if it is, the pattern still matters." She nodded once and went back to work. Another inch, then another. The soil shifted subtly, still compact, but with a faint difference in resistance. Not enough to see, just enough to feel. Joel noticed it too. "Hold," he said quietly. Mara stepped back. Joel leaned forward, brushing away the loose dirt with slower, more precise movements. His fingers traced the surface, pressing gently in small arcs, mapping something invisible. Then a dull, hollow sound, barely there. He tapped again, this time with the end of the digging bar. The sound came back, unmistakable now, not stone, not root, something else. Mara felt her grip tighten slightly around the spade. Joel cleared more soil from the area, revealing a curved edge just beneath the surface, dark, worn, coated in years of packed earth. "Metal," he said. They worked together now, more carefully than before. No force, no rush. Just slow, patient removal, uncovering the shape piece by piece. A cylinder, about the length of a forearm, sealed at one end, capped at the other. Old, not buried deep, just forgotten long enough to disappear. When it finally came free, Joel lifted it out with both hands, brushing away the remaining dirt. The surface was rusted but intact, the seams still holding after all those years beneath the ground. Mara watched without speaking. The world around them seemed to pull back, sound softening, movement fading, until there was only the object in Joel's hands and the space it had come from. He turned it slowly, examining the cap. "Still sealed," he murmured. "Open it," Mara said. Joel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of recognition, that whatever was inside would not be random. It would belong to something that had once mattered enough to protect. Then he twisted. The cap resisted at first, then gave with a low, grinding sound as the seal broke. A faint rush of air escaped, carrying with it the dry, stale scent of paper and time. Joel tipped the container slightly, and something inside shifted. Carefully, he reached in and pulled out the first item. A photograph. Faded, edges curled, but still intact. Mara stepped closer. The image showed a group of mustangs, dust rising around them, bodies mid-motion, captured in a moment that had once been urgent. Markings were visible on their flanks, tags, numbers. Joel's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "That's from a roundup," he said. He reached back into the container, pulling out more, thin stacks of paper bound loosely with a deteriorated band. Handwritten notes, coordinates, identification codes. Mara felt a slow, steady weight settle in her chest. "This was logged," she said. "Someone documented all this." Joel nodded, flipping through the pages with careful fingers. "Yeah," he said quietly, and then it never made it where it was supposed to go. The wind picked up slightly, lifting the edge of one of the papers before Joel pressed it back down. Behind them, a soft sound broke the stillness. Mara turned. Calder stood at the edge of the patch again. Closer this time, not stepping forward, not retreating, just there, watching. Joel followed her gaze, then looked back at the documents in his hands. "These aren't just notes," he said. "They're identifiers." Mara's eyes moved between Calder and the container. "For him?" she asked. Joel shook his head slowly. "Not just him." He looked down at the photograph again, then at the codes written beneath it. "This connects to more horses than we can see from here." The realization didn't come like a shock. It came like something settling into place, quiet, unavoidable. The patch of ground wasn't holding an answer. It was holding a record. And as Mara looked back at Calder, standing with that same calm stillness he had shown every evening before, she understood something that shifted the weight of the entire moment. He hadn't been returning to remember. He had been returning to something that had never been finished. By midday, the papers had been moved inside. Mara cleared a section of the old work table near the barn window, where the light came in steady and clean. No shadows cutting across the surface, no flicker, just enough clarity to see what time had tried to erase. Joel laid everything out with care, photographs first, then the folded sheets, then the smaller tags, each one marked with numbers that had once meant something precise. The air inside carried a faint dryness, the kind that made old paper feel brittle at the edges. For a while, neither of them spoke. They read, not quickly, not scanning for conclusions, but slowly letting each line settle before moving to the next. Coordinates written in narrow script, date stamps, short notes that seemed practical at the time they were made, nothing emotional, nothing reflective, just records. "This was field documentation," Joel said quietly, tracing a line with his finger. "Not official entry, the kind you're supposed to transfer later." Mara leaned against the edge of the table, her arms folded loosely. "And if it doesn't get transferred?" Joel didn't look up. "Then it stays here, or gets lost, or—" He paused slightly. "Gets buried with everything else that moved on." Mara let that sit. Outside, the sound of hooves drifted faintly through the open barn door. The herd had shifted closer to the waterline. Calder's shape passed once across the doorway, then disappeared again into the light. Joel reached for one of the photographs. A group of mustangs mid-run, dust rising behind them. Markings visible, numbers painted across their sides, some clearer than others. He flipped the photo over. A code was written on the back, followed by a date. "Cross-reference that," he said. Mara pulled a laptop closer, the screen lighting up against the muted tones of the barn. She accessed the database she rarely needed, BLM adoption records, intake logs, the kind of system built to track movement, not memory. Joel read the code aloud. She typed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a record appeared. Mara's eyes narrowed slightly. "This one's listed under a different herd origin." Joel frowned. "That's not what the field note says." He checked again. Same number, same date, different designation. Mara clicked deeper, pulling up additional entries. The more they compared, the clearer it became. It wasn't just one, another code, another mismatch, then another. Joel leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. These horses were processed, but not correctly. Mara looked at him. "How many?" Joel didn't answer immediately. He reached for another sheet, scanning quickly now, not rushing, but no longer moving at the same measured pace as before. "Enough," he said finally. The word hung heavier than it sounded. Mara turned back to the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Some of these have already been adopted." Joel nodded once. "Yeah." "And the others?" "Still in holding, or moved again." The room felt smaller suddenly. not because of the space, but because of what it held. Mara pushed herself upright, stepping away from the table. She walked toward the barn door, stopping just at the threshold. The light outside had shifted into late afternoon, casting long lines across the pasture. Calder stood near the fence. Not at the patch this time, not doing anything unusual, just standing. Mara studied him for a moment, then looked back over her shoulder. "He didn't bring us there," she said. Joel followed her gaze. "No. He just kept going back." Joel stepped beside her. "And we decided to follow that." They stood there in silence, the weight of it settling in, not as urgency, not as panic, but as something steadier, responsibility. Mara turned back inside. "We need to contact the sanctuary network," she said. "Start with the ones listed here." Joel nodded. "And flag the records." "Will it change anything?" she asked. Joel didn't pretend to soften it. "It won't fix everything." Mara picked up one of the photographs, holding it for a moment longer than necessary before setting it back down. "But it'll change what happens next," she said. Joel met her eyes briefly. "That's the part that still counts." Outside, the wind moved through the pasture again, carrying the low, steady sound of the herd, shifting as one. Mara gathered the documents into a careful stack, not to put them away, but to move them forward. And somewhere beyond the barn, beyond the fences and the long stretch of land that held more history than anyone had recorded properly, a quiet truth had begun to take shape. Not everything buried is meant to stay hidden. Some things wait, not for discovery, but for correction. The calls didn't happen all at once. They moved slowly at first. One number dialed, one name checked, one record pulled from a system that had never expected to be questioned this far back. Mara sat at the same table for hours each day, the papers spread before her like a map that refused to stay still. Joel handled the verification. Tessa reached out to other sanctuaries. And somewhere between those quiet actions, the story began to shift, not outward in spectacle, but inward, where decisions carry weight long after they're made. Some responses came quickly. A ranch in Nevada confirmed a gelding that matched one of the misidentified codes. A small rescue outside Twin Falls found a mare whose markings didn't align with her documented origin. Not dramatic discoveries, not reunions waiting to happen, just corrections. Other calls ended in silence. Disconnected numbers, closed operations, horses that had already passed through too many hands to trace back with certainty. Mara wrote those down anyway, marking each one not as failure but as unfinished, because not everything could be recovered, but that didn't mean nothing could be changed. Days passed, then a week. The documents moved from the table into folders, then into copies, then into systems that could hold them longer than paper ever could. Joel submitted formal flags. Tessa coordinated updates with quiet persistence, never pushing harder than the process allowed, but never stepping back either. And through it all, Calder remained. At first he continued his routine. Each evening, just as the light began to fall, he would drift from the herd and walk the same path. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. But something was different. He no longer stayed as long. Where he once stood for minutes that stretched into stillness, now he paused only briefly, lowering his head, holding that quiet space for a moment, then lifting it again as if something unseen had shifted beneath him. Mara noticed before anyone else. She didn't speak about it right away. She just watched. On the 9th evening after they uncovered the canister, Calder walked toward the edge of the pasture, then stopped short of the patch. He stood there, a few yards away, his ears turning once, his body settling into stillness. But he didn't step forward. Mara leaned lightly against the fence, her hands resting where they always had. Joel stood beside her. "He's changing the pattern," Joel said quietly. Mara nodded. "Or finishing it," she replied. They stayed there until the last of the light drained from the sky, neither of them needing to say anything more, because the place itself had already done what it needed to do. In the days that followed, the patch remained untouched. No markers, no digging, no attempt to reshape it into something meaningful by human hands. Mara made that decision early and held to it. The ground would stay as it was, Not as a monument, not as a reminder, just as a place. One that had held something long enough to matter. And then let it go. The sanctuary moved forward. New intake procedures were reviewed, cross-checks added where none had existed before. Small changes, practical ones. The kind that wouldn't be noticed from the outside, but would quietly alter the path of horses yet to arrive. No announcements were made. No one gathered to mark what had happened. Because what changed wasn't meant to be seen all at once. It was meant to carry forward. On a clear morning, weeks later, Mara stood at the edge of the pasture as the herd moved across the open land. The air was lighter now, the wind softer as it moved through the grass. Calder was among them, not apart, not distant, just one body within the slow, steady motion of the group. He didn't turn toward the old patch. He didn't need to. Mara watched him for a long moment, then let her gaze drift beyond, to the stretch of land that held more than anyone had written down, more than any system could fully contain. There was no clear ending to it, no final moment that marked completion. Just a quiet understanding that something had been set back into place, not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. And sometimes that was enough. Some places do not call for attention. They wait, holding what has been left behind until someone is willing to look without expectation and act without certainty. So when a horse returns again and again to the same ground, perhaps the question is not what it remembers, but what we have chosen to forget. What would you have done, walked past it, or stopped long enough to notice? This story leaves behind something simple, but not small. Care is not proven in moments of rescue alone, but in the willingness to correct what no one else sees. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to share your thoughts and follow the journey for more stories that move quietly but matter deeply.
If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more stories like this.